My children, Sarah and Olivia, told me it was the trip of a lifetime, a luxury cruise they couldn't miss. They talked about it for months, their voices buzzing with excitement. Every detail from the gourmet meals to the exotic ports. What they didn't tell me, not really, was that to them, my life just wasn't as important. It felt like an afterthought, a minor detail in their grand plan. They packed their bags, those enormous suitcases dragging across my polished floors. And then they left me alone in this immense house. It was just a day before my 73rd birthday, and they threw out that empty promise, "We'll celebrate later, Mom." It hung in the air, hollow and weightless. Little did they know, the biggest surprise wasn't on their travel itinerary, filled with all those glamorous destinations. No, the real surprise was already waiting for them, hidden in the silence of this very house. The one they already treated as if it were their own. I heard the front door clicks, and I stood there, right in the middle of the living room, the quiet suddenly so vast it pressed in on me. My eyes drifted to the photo frames on the mantelpiece. There we were, a family, smiling. A happy family, it seemed. But in that moment, seeing them there, frozen in time, I knew the truth. Our life together, the one captured in those pictures, was built on such a fragile foundation. A foundation, I now realized, of convenience. Their convenience. The echo of their receding footsteps. The sound of their car pulling away from the curb. It all still resonated in my ears. A ghost of their presence, fading fast. But then, something else began to stir within me. It wasn't a sound you could hear with your ears, but one that resonated deep in my soul. An older sound, much more powerful than any retreating footsteps. It was a promise I had kept to myself, tucked away for far too long, almost forgotten. But now, it began to awaken. I imagined them already on that ship, probably toasting with champagne glasses, clinking them together, laughing, already posting photos of exotic landscapes and endless blue ocean. And here I was, looking at the familiar walls of this house. Each wall, each room, held so many secrets. Secrets they never bothered to learn. They were busy toasting to a future they thought was theirs, completely unaware that the past was about to demand its price. The weight of it felt tangible, sitting there in the quiet. They wanted this house. I knew they did. They coveted it, silently, always eyeing it, planning its future. But the inheritance they dreamed of already had a defined owner. And that owner, they couldn't even begin to imagine who it was. Not truly. They thought they knew me, thought they knew this place. But they were so wrong. The house stood still around me, holding its breath, waiting. And what fate was preparing for their return was something no money could buy or prevent. My name is Helena. I'm 72 years old. It's been almost a decade since my husband passed away, and I've been a widow. All my life, I was a seamstress. Not just with fabric, though. I think I spent more time mending the small tears in our family's daily life. Little disagreements, scraped knees, broken toys, quiet worries. I tried to patch everything up, make it whole again. I raised my 2 daughters, Sarah and Olivia, right here in this house. This house. It's large, it's old. My late husband and I, we poured so much into it. So much sweat, so many quiet evenings planning, fixing, building. We made it a home. To Sarah and Olivia, though, it was just property, an old property, an asset, they called it, something to be divided up later when I was gone. But for me, this house was my entire world. It's been the stage for every single memory that truly matters. Every Christmas morning, every birthday party, every tear, every laugh. From their first steps, wobbling across this very living room, to their graduation photos tacked on the fridge. It's all here. I always cared for every corner of this place, with a tenderness they just never seemed to understand. I'd spend hours, sometimes, just tending to the ferns. They're old, these ferns. They belonged to my grandmother. She always said they brought good luck. I still water them every Tuesday, talking to them softly. I polish the furniture too. The heavy oak table in the dining room, the old dresser in my bedroom. That dresser, it came from my great Uncle Arthur. I barely knew him, really. He died when I was just a little girl. But my mother, she always spoke of him with such respect. A kind man, she'd say, a man who always kept his word. And he left this furniture to our family, saying it should always stay in the women's line. In one of the locked drawers of that very dresser, I keep a metal box. It's a plain, unassuming box, nothing fancy. But inside, that's my small treasure trove of secrets. Old documents, crackly with age, deeds with faded ink, yellowed letters tied with brittle ribbon that belong to my lineage. Not my husband's side, but my mother's, my grandmother's. Generations of my family's story hidden there, my history. My daughters, Sarah and Olivia, they were always so busy with their own lives. Too busy, it seemed, to ever ask about these papers, or about the history of this house, before their father came into the picture, before he even proposed to them. I was just Mom. A permanent fixture, always there, always ready to help, to listen, to cook. A serviceable figure. My personal history, the things that made me Helena, not just Mom, well, that just didn't matter to them. They saw the walls of this house, the paint, the chipped corners, but they never saw the foundations. They never looked deep enough. And it was precisely in those foundations, the ones they ignored, that the real truth was hidden. The truth that would change absolutely everything. I knew it. I'd known it for a long, long time, and I was holding on to it. Tucked away among those old papers, nestled deep inside that metal box, was the one document. A one true document that would redefine all our futures, all of ours. And they had no idea. They just didn't know that among those old papers was the document that would redefine all our futures. They just didn't know that. Among those old papers was the document that would redefine all our futures. Everything began to change, slowly at first, a few months ago. It wasn't a sudden storm, but more like a creeping fog settling in. Their visits, which used to be lively and frequent, began to grow shorter. My daughters, Sarah and Olivia, always seemed to be in a hurry. Just dropping by, Mom, they'd say. their eyes already scanning the clock, their minds clearly somewhere else. And the calls, those long chats we used to have about their day, my day, everything and nothing, well, they became rarer. A quick "how are you" before a hurried "gotta go, Mom, busy day." I'd try to tell them something, a little anecdote about the neighbor or a funny thing the cat did, but I could feel their attention slipping away, like sand through my fingers. Then the trip started to consume them. It was all they talked about. "Mom, you wouldn't believe it. It's a unique opportunity. A cruise around Europe, all paid in 10 installments." Sarah would exclaim, her eyes shining with an almost childish glee. Olivia would chime in, detailing the stops, the excursions, the fancy dinners. They sounded like travel brochures come to life. I saw their excitement, truly, and I tried to be happy for them. I really did, but every time they mentioned the departure date, a sharp pang of sadness hit me right in the chest. It was like a little jab over and over again. The trip was planned for the eve of my birthday, my 73rd birthday. I remember the day I finally gathered my courage to say something. I tried to sound gentle, almost casual. "Girls," I started, as they were buzzing about cabin numbers and passport checks, "do you think maybe you could postpone it for just a week? My birthday, you know?" The words barely left my mouth before Olivia cut me off, her voice quick and cold, like a draft under a door. "Imagine, Mom, everything's already bought. Flights, excursions, everything. You understand, right? It's non-refundable." Sarah nodded in agreement, not even looking at me. "We'll have a little cake later," she added, almost as an afterthought. A little cake later. The words felt like an alms, a tiny handout, a consolation prize for something that was sacred to me, my birthday, a day that for years had been just ours, a family day. Now it was just an inconvenience, something to be brushed aside by a grand cruise. From that moment on, any conversation we had was dominated by their itinerary, the clothes they would buy, the shoes, the excursions they would book, the money they needed for spending. Their voices would light up when they spoke of Venice or Paris, but they dimmed to a dull hum when they spoke to me. It was as if I was just background noise. The coldness settled in for good after that. It wasn't just in their voices, but in their very presence. When they came home, they wouldn't sit and chat like before. Instead, they would walk through the rooms, their eyes darting around, measuring the space. I'd catch them whispering to each other, low voices, almost conspiratorial. "Modernizing the place," I heard Sarah say once, her gaze sweeping over my grandmother's antique cabinet. "Sale potential," Olivia mumbled back, standing in the doorway of the dining room, the very room where we had shared so many meals, so much laughter, so many quiet moments. I felt it. Then, I felt like an old object myself. Part of the decor, a piece of furniture that would soon be discarded, along with the rest of the things they deemed outdated. They weren't just planning a trip, I realized. They were planning a future where I fit in less and less, a future where this house, my home, was just a financial transaction, a future without me at its center, or even, it seemed, on the periphery. My heart felt heavy, like a stone in my chest, weighing me down. And with each passing day, I realized that the distance between us was no longer measured in miles, in the distance to Europe or back. It was measured in something much more profound. It was measured in a heartbreaking lack of love. And with each passing day, I realized that the distance between us was no longer measured in miles, but in a heartbreaking lack of love. The departure day arrived. It was a morning like any other, but then it wasn't. There was a frantic energy in the house, a chaos of last-minute packing and hurried movements. Suitcases, overstuffed and lumpy, lay open on the living room floor, surrounded by piles of clothes and travel accessories. Sarah was on her phone, calling for the rideshare driver, her voice a little sharper than usual. Olivia was zipping up her bag, her brow furrowed in concentration. The house, usually so quiet in the mornings, was filled with a commotion that just didn't include me. I moved around them. "Take care, Mom," Sarah said, already halfway out the door. "If anything, call Mrs. Henderson, our neighbor. You have her number, right?" Olivia nodded, her eyes already on the car. "Lil send updates," she added, not quite meeting my gaze. And just like that, they were gone. The front door slammed shut behind them with a definitive thud. The sudden silence that remained was deafening. It wasn't just quiet. It was an emptiness that pressed in on me, making my ears ring. The next day was my birthday. 73. The house seemed even larger, even emptier than the day before. I woke up expecting the usual excited calls, maybe a video call from Europe, a song sung off-key. But the phone didn't ring, not once. I sat by the window, watching the street, the hours ticking by. Nothing. Near lunchtime, my phone buzzed. My heart leaped. I grabbed it, hope blooming in my chest. It was a single text message from Sarah. "Happy birthday, Mom. So busy here. Kisses." That was it. No call, no photo, just 5 words and a dismissive emoticon. The hope shriveled that night as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in lonely hues of orange and purple. I sat at the dining room table, the same table where we had celebrated so many Christmases, so many family birthdays, so many milestones. The laughter, the clinking of glasses, the lively chatter. It all echoed in my memory, a ghost of what used to be. I had gone to the bakery earlier and bought myself a small cake, just a tiny one, enough for a single serving. I placed a single candle in the center, a thin white stick of wax, and lit it. The small flame flickered, a tiny beacon in the vastness of the empty room. As the hot wax dripped slowly down the side of the candle, forming little rivulets of white, my own tears streamed down my face. They weren't loud, racking sobs. They were quiet, steady tears. A slow ache in my chest that had finally found release. There, in that immense solitude, with only the candle for company, I understood the true depth of their abandonment. It wasn't just about the trip, or the money, or the inconvenience. It was about their conscious choice to leave me behind, to treat me as a footnote, a small, irrelevant detail in the grand story they wanted to live. That untouched cake in front of me, the one I had bought myself, the one sitting there, uneaten, was the starkest symbol of my invisibility. It was a testament to how little I mattered. In that moment, the pain was so great that for an instant I forego. I felt raw, empty, but then something shifted. The deep, heavy sadness that had settled over me began to lift, slowly, like a mist clearing from a field. In its place, a strange, cold calm descended, a clarity. It was a feeling I hadn't known in years, perhaps not since my husband passed, and even then, it was a different kind of quiet. This was sharper, more focused. It wasn't the peace of resignation, but the quiet of resolve. I didn't reach for the phone, not to call Sarah, not to call Olivia, not to demand explanations or pour out my hurt. I didn't send messages, no texts laden with bitterness or guilt-tripping words. There was no point. They wouldn't have listened, not really. They would have offered platitudes, quick apologies, then gone back to their cruise. I knew them too well. I decided right then that my silence would be my answer. It would speak louder than any words I could utter. They wanted distance. They would certainly have it, but it would be on my terms now. On my terms, not theirs. I was taking back control, quietly, steadily. I pushed myself up from the dining room table, leaving the untouched cake and the flickering candle behind. My legs felt a little shaky, but my steps were firm as I walked to my room. It felt different now, not just a place to sleep, but a sanctuary, a command center. I went straight to my dresser, the one my great-uncle Arthur had left to the family. My fingers traced the familiar patterns carved into the wood. I pulled open the locked drawer, the one I had just been thinking about days before. The old key turned with a soft click, a sound that usually went unnoticed, but now felt significant. Inside, nestled beneath a faded silk scarf, was the metal box. It was a simple tin box, once used for biscuits, but it held so much more. I lifted it out, feeling its familiar weight in my hands. The cool metal was grounding. I sat on the edge of my bed, placing the box carefully on my lap. Inside, along with old, sepia-toned photos of my parents, looking so young, so full of hope, there was an envelope. It was thick, made of heavy paper, and the return address was a law firm I recognized, Mr. Davies' office. It had arrived a few weeks ago, a very formal-looking letter, but in the chaos of my daughter's pre-trip excitement, I had merely tucked it away, knowing what it meant, but not quite ready to deal with its full implications. Until now. This was the final notification, the last piece of a long, drawn-out process. It was my great-uncle Arthur's probate, a matter that had dragged on for years, a complicated web of old trusts and obscure clauses, tangled up in the past. I had never mentioned it to Sarah or Olivia. It was my business, my history, not theirs. They had no idea it even existed, let alone that it was finally, truly resolved. With a steady hand, I opened the envelope. My eyes scanned the official language, the legal jargon, but my gaze fixed on the words that confirmed what I already knew deep in my bones. It was all there, in black and white, clear and undeniable. Holding that document, I felt a strength rise within me. It wasn't the hot, impulsive rush of anger, the kind that makes you want to lash out. No, this was different. This was a quiet, deep strength, a sense of dignity that seemed to hum through my very veins. It felt like it came not just from me, but from generations of women before me, from my mother, my grandmother, all the way back to Great Uncle Arthur. It was a quiet power, slow and ancient. I remembered something my father used to tell me, his voice warm and firm. "Helena," he'd say, "never let anyone, not even your own, make you feel small in your own home. This house, our home, is a part of who we are. It holds our history, our worth. Protect it." His words, long dormant in my memory, resonated with new meaning now. They echoed in the quiet room, a powerful reminder. I carefully folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope, sliding it back into the metal box. I closed the lid, the soft click, final and decisive. I didn't need to act immediately. Their trip, in a strange twist of fate, had given me exactly what I needed. Time. Time to organize my thoughts, to solidify my resolve, and to plan my next step. It wouldn't be with the fury of revenge, not that. It would be with the serene, unshakable conviction of justice. A calm, deliberate justice. They would return from their grand cruise, tanned and full of stories, to the very same house they had left. But they would not find the same mother they had so casually left behind. The next 2 weeks felt both incredibly long and strangely quick. They were an exercise in solitude, yes, but more so, an exercise in observation. My days settled into a quiet rhythm, a silence that once felt deafening, but now felt informative. I watched. I listened. Not with my ears, not always, but with a different kind of awareness. I was waiting. Waiting for them to come back. Waiting for the next step. Waiting for the truth of their abandonment to truly sink in. Not just for me, but for everyone. Photos kept arriving on my phone, little flashes of their grand adventure. Dinners in fancy Paris restaurants. Their faces flushed and happy. Gondola rides in Venice, posing with silly grins. Sun-drenched beaches in Santorini, the blue water stretching out forever. Each picture was a sharp little reminder of where they were and where I wasn't. But what struck me most, what truly spoke volumes, was the absence of anything else. No calls asking how I was, no messages wondering if I needed anything, no quick thinking of you from the middle of a bustling square. Just the bright, glossy images of their lives without me. They were completely immersed in their world, and I was not a part of it. My sister-in-law Brenda called once. She's my late husband's younger sister, and we'd known each other for decades. Her voice was cheerful, almost giddy. "Helena, it's so good that the girls are enjoying themselves. You know they deserve it. They work so hard." Her words, delivered with such an innocent tone, felt like a fresh wound. It wasn't just Sarah and Olivia. It was almost as if Brenda, too, was complicit in my exclusion, as if it was perfectly normal, even deserved, that I was here alone while they celebrated. Her words twisted something inside me. They deserved it. And what did I deserve? It was then I began to truly realize it. For the rest of the family, the wider circle, I was already out of the picture. The elderly mother. A widow living in a house that was now too big for just one person. The one who would soon my nieces and nephews who used to pop in for a visit, or at least a phone call, now seemed too busy. Their lives, too, were suddenly full of excuses, full of distance. It was like a silent agreement had been made, unspoken but understood. My daughter's blatant abandonment had somehow given everyone else a license to forget me too, to push me to the side. The height of my pain came without warning, from an unexpected place. I was out on my porch, watering my small potted herbs, when I overheard, by chance, a conversation. It was my neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, talking at her gate to another woman I didn't recognize. Their voices carried clearly on the morning air, oblivious to my presence behind the rose bushes. "Poor Mrs. Helena," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice laced with a performative pity that made my skin crawl. "Her daughters are having such a grand time while she's alone in that big old house. Good thing they'll sell it soon, I heard, and put her in a smaller, more appropriate place." I froze. The watering can tilted in my hand, water spilling onto the dry pavement. My face burned, not just with heat, but with a sudden, humiliating flush that spread through my entire body. A smaller, more appropriate place. To them, to the world. I wasn't Helena anymore. I was a burden, an old antique gathering dust, just waiting to be boxed up and stored away in some forgotten corner. I wasn't a person with a history, with memories, with a life. I was just property, like this house. And both of us were waiting to be sold off, traded, rehomed. The sting of that casual dismissal, the thought of being discussed as if I were a piece of furniture, was almost unbearable. But as the storm of contempt gathered around me, as the voices faded and the quiet humiliation settled in, I felt something else stirring, deep inside. It wasn't a feeling of shrinking away. No, it was a strange, defiant surge, a quiet strength. The contempt, the pity, the silent dismissal. It only served to water the seed of change that was already inside me. The one that was about to sprout, but the storm of contempt that formed around me only served to water the seed of change that was about to sprout. They returned 2 weeks later, just as I expected, tanned, full of stories, their voices bubbling with excited chatter about Rome and Paris and the endless blue of the Mediterranean. They hauled their huge shopping bags into the living room, dropping them onto my sofa with a thump. Designer scarves, little trinkets, souvenirs from every port. They looked different, lighter almost, like they'd shed something in Europe. I watched them, pouring tea, serving some of the small biscuits I'd baked. I listened, nodding, offering quiet responses. I didn't mention my birthday. I didn't mention the text message. I just watched and waited. For a few days, it was just like that. The house was noisy again, filled with their presents, their bags, their laundry. They talked about their adventures, sometimes asking me, almost as an afterthought, if I'd had a quiet 2 weeks. I'd just say yes, it was quiet. I was fine. And they'd go back to their stories. Then, just as I knew it would, the conversation I both expected and dreaded finally happened. It was a Tuesday morning. We were in the living room, sorting through some travel photos they wanted to show me. Sarah cleared her throat, a little louder than necessary. "Mom," she began, her voice trying to sound gentle, almost thoughtful, but I could hear the practiced tone underneath. She exchanged a quick look with Olivia, a silent signal, and Olivia nodded. "Mom, we were thinking," Sarah continued, her eyes sweeping around the room, taking in the old furniture, the familiar walls. "This house, it's a waste, isn't it? Just for you alone?" Olivia chimed in, stepping forward. "Yes, it's so much to maintain. And the market is really good right now. Mom, we thought of selling it." My heart beat a little faster, but my face remained calm. I kept my gaze steady on them. "We could sell it," Olivia went on, warming to the idea, "and buy a really great apartment for you. Something modern, smaller, easier to manage, near us maybe." And then she paused, a hopeful glint in her eye. "We could use the rest of the money to invest. For all of us, of course. A real nest egg." They talked for a long time, laying out their entire plan, every detail. How much they thought the house was worth, the kind of apartment I'd have, the wonderful investments they'd make with the extra money. Their money, my inheritance. They spoke as if I wasn't even in the room, or rather, as if I was merely a puzzle piece to be moved around, part of their grand financial strategy. I listened to it all, the cool calculations, the eager tones, the complete absence of any question about what I wanted. When they finally finished, the silence in the room felt heavy, expectant. They looked at me, waiting for my cheerful agreement, my gratitude. I took a slow breath, holding their gaze. My voice, when I spoke, was calm, steady, and clear. "I understand," I said. The simplicity of my words seemed to catch them off guard. They exchanged another glance, a flicker of confusion in their eyes. "But before you decide what to do with our inheritance," I continued, a slight emphasis on the word "our," "I'd like you to meet someone." I rose from the sofa, my movements deliberate, and walked over to the old landline phone on the hallway table. My daughters watched me, bewildered. I picked up the receiver and dialed the number I had already memorized. It rang twice, then a familiar voice answered. "Mr. Davies," I said, my voice unwavering. "Helena here. Yes, I think now would be a good time for that visit. My daughters are home." I listened for a moment, then hung up. "He'll be here in about half an hour," I told them, turning back. Sarah looked at Olivia, her brows furrowed. "Mr. Davies? Who's Mr. Davies, Mom?" Olivia asked, a note of suspicion creeping into her tone. I didn't answer. I just walked back to the sofa and sat down, my hands clasped in my lap. We waited. The comfortable silence of the house was now laced with an almost unbearable tension. Precisely half an hour later, the doorbell rang. I rose again and went to open it. Standing on my porch was Mr. Davies, my lawyer. He was a kindly man in his 60s, with a neat gray beard and warm, intelligent eyes. He carried a leather briefcase, old and worn. I invited him in, and he entered, taking in Sarah and Olivia, who were now standing awkwardly in the living room, eyeing him with growing apprehension. We all sat down. Mr. Davies placed his briefcase on the coffee table. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. He opened the briefcase, took out a neatly folded stack of documents, and looked from Sarah to Olivia, then settled his gaze on me, a respectful nod in his eyes. "Ladies," he began, his voice calm and professional, "I was retained by Mrs. Helena to regularize the documentation of this property." He gestured around the living room. Sarah and Olivia shifted, still looking confused, maybe a little irritated. "The house you are in," he continued, his voice resonating in the sudden silence, "never belonged to your late father's estate." His words hung in the air. Sarah's eyes widened slightly. Olivia's mouth opened, then closed. "It was inherited by your mother," Mr. Davies stated, looking directly at them, "as the sole beneficiary in your great-uncle Arthur's will. A long and complex probate, but now fully resolved. The final deed, in Helena's exclusive name, was registered 2 weeks ago." The silence that followed was heavy, dense, suffocating. You could have heard a pin drop. It was the kind of silence that screams. Their faces, so recently tanned from the European sun, turned pale. The color drained from them, leaving them looking ghostly, shocked. They looked at Mr. Davies, then at the documents on the table. Then, slowly, their eyes swiveled to me. And for the first time in years, I mean truly, for the very first time since they became adults, since their father passed away, they really saw me. Not just Mom, not the old woman. They saw Helena, the woman who owned the house. In that instant, I could feel the realization hitting them, washing over them like a cold wave. The ground they stood on wasn't their inheritance. It wasn't a family asset to be divided. It was my home, my property, and the final decision about its future, and theirs, had always been mine. In that instant, I could feel the realization hitting them, washing over them like a cold wave. The ground they stood on wasn't their inheritance. It wasn't a family asset to be divided. It was my home, my property, and the final decision about its future, and theirs, had always been mine. I didn't kick them out. That thought never even crossed my mind. Revenge, true revenge, was never in my plans. That wasn't the kind of person I wanted to be, not after all these years. But the dynamics of this house, the very air we breathed within these walls, changed dramatically. It was like a switch had been flipped, quietly, irrevocably. The truth had been spoken, and with it, a new chapter began. The very next morning, the house felt different. Quieter, somehow. I found Sarah and Olivia in the kitchen, making their coffee, their usual morning chatter noticeably absent. I called then for a talk. "Sit down," I said, my voice calm, but with a firmness I hadn't used with them in years. "We need to talk." They looked at me, a flicker of something new in their eyes, apprehension. They sat. "This is my house," I began, looking from one to the other. My voice was steady, calm, and it disarmed them. They didn't interrupt. They didn't roll their eyes, as they so often did when I tried to express a thought that didn't align with theirs. And from today on, the rules are mine. Respect is no longer optional. It's a requirement to live here. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The quiet power of my words, backed by the revelation of the day before, was enough. For the very first time in what felt like forever, they listened. Truly listened. And so, gradually, day by day, I began to bring life back into this house and into myself. It wasn't a sudden burst of activity, but a slow, gentle unfolding. My days no longer revolved around waiting for their calls or catering to their needs. I started with small things. My husband's old office, which had sat unused and dusty since he passed, became my new sewing studio. I moved my old machine in there, brought out my fabrics, my spools of thread. I put a sign out front, just a small, hand-painted one, offering alterations and small custom orders. The neighbors, many of whom remembered my work from years ago, started bringing things. A tear in a dress, a hem to be adjusted, a custom cushion cover. The whir of the sewing machine became a comforting sound, a rhythm that was mine. I finally started that small herb garden on the porch, something I had always wanted to do, but never found the time or felt I had the permission somehow. I planted rosemary, basil, thyme. Their earthy scents filled the air, a small, vibrant patch of green. I spent hours there, weeding, watering, feeling the sun on my face. It was a simple joy, a quiet happiness that had been neglected for too long. I reconnected with distant cousins, ones I hadn't spoken to in years, and even a few friends from my youth. We had long, rambling phone calls, remembering old times, sharing laughter, catching up on decades of life. The house, which had once felt like a mausoleum of memories, quiet and still, began to echo with new sounds. The whir of my sewing machine, the gentle hum of my own singing as I worked, the low murmur of conversation with a cousin, and yes, sometimes, even the soft sound of my own laughter. It was alive again. Sarah and Olivia still live here, for now. The relationship between us is difficult. It's full of silences, moments of awkwardness, and clumsy attempts at closeness that don't quite land right. They haven't moved out. I haven't asked them to. But they are being forced to see me in a new light. They are being forced to see me as Helena, the woman, the owner of her own story, the one who holds the deeds to this house, and not just as Mom, the ever-present, ever-serving figure. I don't know if their love for me will ever be truly genuine again, not like it was when they were little girls. But they have learned what respect is. And I have learned, finally, not to accept anything less than that. Not from them, not from anyone. I didn't need a luxury cruise. My greatest journey was the journey back to myself. I didn't need a luxury cruise. My greatest journey was the journey back to myself. And looking back now, sitting here in my quiet sewing studio, the hum of the machine a comforting sound, I see it so clearly. The greatest inheritance I received wasn't this house, not just the bricks and mortar and the land it sits on. It was something far more precious, something no deed or will could ever truly convey. It was the reclaiming of my own worth. It's strange, isn't it? How sometimes we give so much of ourselves, especially for our family. We pour out our time, our energy, our love, our very identity into raising children into supporting a spouse, into keeping a home. We mend clothes, we mend hearts, we mend arguments. We become the glue, the constant, the one who is always there. And in that constant giving, that endless pouring out, we can forget who we are. We forget our own strength, the quiet power that lies within us, simply because we've been so focused on everyone else's needs, everyone else's happiness. For so long, I was mom, just mom, useful, reliable, always there to listen, to cook, to fix. My own dreams, my own history, my own needs, they slowly faded into the background, like old photographs left in the sun. I thought that was love. I thought that was what being a mother meant. And maybe, in part, it is. But I learned a harsh truth, one that stung worse than any betrayal. My value, in their eyes, seemed to diminish the less I was needed, the less I could actively do for them. It seemed to vanish entirely when my only offering was simply my presence, my quiet existence. The abandonment, the pain of that birthday, the casual dismissal from my own family, it hurt deeply. It peeled back layers of assumptions I had held for decades. It showed me how easily I had allowed myself to become invisible, how I had allowed my own worth to be defined by the needs of others. But in that hurt, something new began to grow. A quiet stubbornness, a realization that my dignity was not up for negotiation, that my home was my sanctuary, not just an asset, and that I, Helena, was a person deserving of respect, regardless of my age, regardless of what I could offer, simply because I exist. It feels like a universal lesson, somehow. So many of us, as we grow older, as our roles change, as the bustling world moves on, feel this shift. We can become footnotes in our own stories, seen by others not for who we are, but for what we once were, or what we can still do for them. We become objects of pity, or worse, problems to be managed. Our wisdom, our experience, our very presence, often unseen, unheard, undervalued. It's a quiet erasure, isn't it? One that happens so subtly you barely notice it until you're standing alone in a silent house on your birthday, wondering where everyone went. The injustice of it all, the feeling of being discarded, it forced me to remember who Helena was before she was just mom. It reminded me of my father's words, "Never let anyone make you feel small in your own home." And my own home, I realized, was not just this house, but my own body, my own spirit, my own life. I had to reclaim that too. The path has been difficult, full of quiet struggles, full of awkward conversations, and the slow, slow rebuilding of trust, if that's even possible. But it's my path now. I choose where it leads. This journey, it's a feeling of quiet power, a deep knowing that settles in your bones. And that makes me wonder, and you? Have you ever felt that your worth was only remembered when someone needed something from you? I look at my story now, this life I've been living, and I see it so clearly. The greatest inheritance I truly received wasn't just this house, these old walls, the land it sits on. No, that was merely the vessel. The real treasure, the most precious thing, was the reclaiming of my own worth. It's a quiet knowing that has settled deep in my bones, a peace that has finally bloomed in my heart. It's strange, isn't it? How often we give so much of ourselves, especially for our family. We pour out our time, our energy, our love, sometimes even our very identity, into raising children, into supporting a spouse, into keeping a home. We mend clothes, we mend broken toys, we try to mend arguments, to smooth over rough edges. We become the glue, the constant, the one who is always there, always reliable. And in that constant giving, that endless pouring out, we can slowly, subtly forget who we are. We forget our own strength, the quiet power that lies within us, simply because we've been so focused on everyone else's needs, everyone else's happiness. For so long, I was mom, just mom, useful, reliable, always there to listen, to cook, to fix. My own dreams, my own history, my own needs, they slowly faded into the background, like old photographs left too long in the sun. I honestly thought that was love. I thought that was what being a good mother truly meant. And maybe, in part, it is. But I learned a harsh truth, one that stung worse than any betrayal. My value, in their eyes, seemed to diminish the less I was actively needed, the less I could do for them. It seemed to vanish entirely when my only offering was simply my presence, my quiet existence. The abandonment, the piercing pain of that birthday, the casual dismissal from my own family, it hurt deeply. It peeled back layers of assumptions I had held for decades. It showed me how easily I had allowed myself to become invisible, not just to them, but even to myself. How I had allowed my own worth to be defined by the needs of others. But in that deep hurt, something new began to grow. A quiet stubbornness, a firm, unshakable realization that my dignity was not up for negotiation, that my home was my sanctuary, not just an asset to be traded, and that I, Helena, was a person deserving of respect, regardless of my age, regardless of what I could offer, simply because I exist. It feels like a universal lesson, somehow. So many of us, as we grow older, as our roles change, as the bustling world moves on, we feel this shift. We can become footnotes in our own stories, seen by others not for who we are, but for what we once were, or what we can still do for them. We become objects of pity, or worse, problems to be managed. Our wisdom, our experience, our very presence, often unseen, unheard, undervalued. It's a quiet erasure, isn't it? One that happens so subtly you barely notice it until you're standing alone in a silent house on your birthday, wondering where everyone went. The injustice of it all, the feeling of being discarded. It forced me to remember who Helena was before she was just mom. It reminded me of my father's words, "Never let anyone make you feel small in your own home." And my own home, I realized, I had to reclaim that too. The path has been difficult, yes, full of quiet struggles, full of awkward conversations, and the slow, slow rebuilding of trust, if that's even truly possible. But it's my path now. I choose where it leads. I'm still here, in this house. My sewing machine hums quietly in the studio. The scent of fresh herbs drifts from the porch. My life is simpler now. Quieter, perhaps. But it is entirely mine. I walk through these rooms, and I don't feel like a forgotten object anymore. I feel like the keeper of a sacred trust, the steward of my own story. I look up at the sky sometimes, just before dusk, watching the colors shift and fade, and I feel a deep, deep peace, a serenity I hadn't known in decades. This journey back to myself, this quiet revolution within these walls, it taught me that true respect starts from within. It's not something you demand, but something you embody. And once you find it, once you truly understand your own inherent value, you simply can't accept anything less, not from anyone. It's a feeling of quiet power, a deep knowing that settles in your bones. And that makes me wonder. And you? Have you ever felt that your worth was only remembered when someone needed something from you? It's a quiet question, I know, one that might linger. But sometimes these quiet questions, these shared experiences, are what truly connect us. They remind us we're not alone in these struggles, in these quiet battles we fight for ourselves. This story of mine, it's not just about me and my daughters or this house. It's about finding your voice again, even when you thought it was lost. It's about understanding that your worth isn't conditional. It just is. And I share it with you, hoping it might echo a little in your own heart, offering a whisper of courage or understanding. Because these real stories, our stories, they matter. They connect us, don't they? And if you want to keep receiving real stories like this, pay attention. YouTube might be unsubscribing you without warning. Confirm if you are still subscribed to the channel and activate the bell.